Hello, and thank you for taking the time to view this presentation on just-in-time resourcing, lean in service operations. This presentation was first given as a thought-provoker at the Lean Service Forum organised by the consultancy firm OEE. As such, you might find some of the points made in this talk a little arguable, but I suppose that was the point. So, if you want to join the discussion and agree or disagree, then please feel free to join in online. The underlying thrust of this talk, from my point of view, is that service operations should not rely too heavily on trying to copy manufacturing practices. Lean in service operations will be very different to lean manufacturing. Let me introduce myself. My name is Neil Bentley, and I'm one of the founders and managing directors of AOMi International. We specialise in helping service operations improve their operations management practices and performance. I think it might be helpful if I spend a moment putting me into context. This may help to explain some of my prejudices and the perspectives I take in this talk. I started my working life in 1984 with Lucas Engineering and Systems. This was a unit within Lucas that was set up to research and apply systems thinking to the various automotive and aerospace factories of that company. In practice, we studied the Toyota production system and implemented a mixture of Kanban and systems thinking and cellular manufacture on a factory-by-factory basis. Back then, we used a picture like this house, and of course, I thought it was all new and we were on some great journey of discovery. It was later that I found out that actually it was sometime in the 30s that the concept of just-in-time was defined and refined by Taiichi Ohno into the Toyota production system. I've since spent many more years working in the service sector, and with a perspective on both service and manufacturing, I believe that the service sector must stop simply copying selected elements of what worked in manufacturing and seek to find its own paradigm shift, similar to that which was pioneered by Toyota all those years ago. But where should we look for that paradigm shift? Well, let's first look at the candidate areas where this paradigm shift might be found. It seems to me that over the years the service industry has borrowed a number of improvement themes from the manufacturing world and tried more or less successfully to adapt them. The three themes of quality improvement, process flow simplification or automation, and changes to the production control method are all interrelated and have all spawned their own lexicon of buzzwords and acronyms. From the world of quality, we have statistical process control, total quality management, and most recently Six Sigma. On the theme of process flow, we have concepts such as cellular manufacture and group technology, and improvement initiatives such as business process re-engineering and of course lean. And from the theme of production control, we have learned from Toyota and others about just-in-time supply and Kanban or pull scheduling. We've also seen developments such as optimized production technology and the theory of constraints. I suspect that some of these terms will be more familiar than others, but one way or another, they've all started out in manufacturing and been tried out in service organisations. The difference in my view is that manufacturing saw a revolutionary and transformational change to the way it set about managing its operations. But so far, we have not seen such a dramatic shift in service operations. I think that it was in the area of production control that the big manufacturing shift in thinking occurred. The move from push manufacturing using MRP to pull or just-in-time manufacturing was a genuine game changer. In my view, this was the change that focused and drove the developments in Lean and in Six Sigma. But where's the same innovation going to come from in service? Can we find that paradigm shift? Well, my short answer is yes, we can find that paradigm shift. And here's a synopsis of what I'm going to say. In summary, I suggest that we look for the service paradigm shift in the same place that manufacturing found it, in the production control method. We should adapt Taiichi Ohno's insight into rivers of inventory to look at rivers of resource in service operations. We should look at the effects of carrying the river of resource and look at how to lower that river, just as Toyota did when looking at inventory. By adapting Taiichi Ohno's theory in this way, we can get to the heart of how lean can be adapted for the service operations environment. I believe that Ohno and the lean program are driving at the same desired outcome, a factory running without the fat of inventory. This same approach can be applied to services, although here, being lean is more about using staff effectively, or rather not being fat with resource. It might seem odd to relate manufacturing inventory to resource or people in service operations, but go with me on this. This is just a starting point for our discussion. I will show that the most common resourcing strategies in service operations can lead to poor productivity, poor service and poor quality, and that lowering the river of resource can help us systematically to identify and resolve fundamental challenges to service performance. I want to start with a personal story that goes back to when I first came across the ideas of the Toyota production system and just-in-time manufacturing back in 1984. I hope this helps to illustrate what I mean by a paradigm shift and why we still need to seek it out in service operations. When I started working in Lucas, I was introduced to this picture. It's a calculation for something called an economic batch quantity, and the science and certainty reflected in the elegant lines on the graph really caught my eye. Essentially, this says that because it costs money to change machines from making one thing to making another, we need to run them for a certain period of time. But at the same time, making more stuff costs money in using up raw materials and then turning them into something that needs to be stored as stock, and so on. The old theory said that there was an inflection point or a trade-off between these two sets of costs that gives us the economic batch quantity, or EBQ. That was fine until the Japanese came along and invented quick change tooling. Instead of accepting the lines on this chart and bowing to the inevitability of the mathematics, Japanese companies used quick change tooling to reduce setup costs. They simply could not afford to tie up money in inventory, so they reframed the problem, and in the process made the EBQ calculation pretty redundant. And it's this reframing of the problem that I think will lead to a similar paradigm shift in service operations. So, producing inventory was expensive. It was a waste, or mudder, as lean people often refer to this. Now, there are 7 forms of mudder apparently, but the one that people always talk about first is the waste of overproduction. And that's what's encapsulated in this shift from the old thinking of the economic batch quantity to the new thinking of just producing what you need. Now, I want to unpack this idea a bit over the next couple of slides because this really goes to the heart of how operations can trip up, service operations can trip up when trying to copy manufacturing. But it also points us to where the service paradigm shift might be. Here on the screen we have the classic push process. First of all, we order in minimum order quantities of raw material, because of course it's cheaper to buy in bulk. And then we build economic batch quantities of sub-assemblies because we want to keep our machines busy. And then we produce our final products in line with a production schedule according to marketing's forecasts. And then we store the final goods, whatever they might be, until someone buys them. But just-in-time manufacturing really was a paradigm shift. It said that producing something you don't need or before you need it is a waste. Effectively, the message was stop trying to optimize a bad system, change the system. Now, Taiichi Ohno had a neat way of encapsulating this mind shift. He introduced the concept of the river of inventory. He said that this river hides manufacturing problems, and by systematically lowering the river, reducing the level of inventory, you could expose and then solve these problems. Now, as I've mentioned, my early understanding of lean was all about the idea of a factory running without the fat of inventory. In this way, both the lean program and Taiichi Ohno's theory are looking to remove the same problem: the wasteful overproduction that is both expensive and hides bigger production issues from view. A lean factory was one which had adopted just-in-time principles in order to run with minimum levels of stock. But what's the equivalent in service operations? I simply don't believe that this concept of lean can translate across to service, even though some people have tried to make a case for it. You can't have sub-assemblies of mortgage applications or insurance claims in storage waiting for the customer to order. You can't do economic batch quantities of inbound calls just because it would be a convenient use of available staffing. However, I still believe that we should look for the service paradigm shift in the same place that manufacturing found it, in the production control method. But first of all, we need to look further into the key differences between service and manufacturing in this area. So, let's look a little more at about how service operations differ from manufacturing. And first of all, let's look at the normal 4 illities associated with service: intangibility, inseparability, perishability and variability. I think the academics now question this list and delight in thinking up service operations that don't have some or all of these characteristics. But it's still a good starting point, so let's just reflect on these for a moment. Intangibility. Very often, the service is actually done by a member of staff to or in the presence of the customer. No goods change hands. There is nothing for the customer to touch and feel. Yes, the money will be in your account on the 6th. It could be a very satisfactory end to a service transaction, but you can't park it outside your house and polish it like a new car. Inseparability. In a similar vein to intangibility, quite often you can't separate the customer from the service. Or as someone put it at a conference I attended a while ago, you actually have to be there to get your hair cut. Perishability. As I've already suggested, services often cannot be stored. They happen in the moment. This has all sorts of implications for our approach to operations management, but in particular it has big implications for quality. You can't scrap and rework a bad phone call in the same way that you might a faulty component. And variability. The very nature of interacting with customers is that it is people talking to other people, which brings a huge level of variability to the product that would just not be countenanced in a manufacturing environment. And all of these things mean that we have to think about lean in a different way. And there are a couple of other points to think about as well. First off, in service operations, there's a high proportion of work which is one and done. Somebody phones up, the agent takes the call, deals with what the customer needs to have dealt with, and that's an end to it. There isn't a long chain of processes. And so a lot of the work on thinking about simplifying processes just simply doesn't apply. And if we end up just trying to make the agent take the call quicker, we're probably missing the point. And similarly, in manufacturing, quite often processes follow a serial chain of events. Whereas the activity in service operations is very often a lot of people doing very similar things working in parallel. And this means that our capacity planning processes need to be different as well. In manufacturing, a lot of it's about line balancing and identifying the bottleneck, the slow process. Whereas in service operations, with things going on in parallel, it's more about how we move work or resource between the different components of our service system. I've shown that in many ways, production control in service is very different to manufacturing. So how do we adapt lean and just-in-time principles in order to create our service paradigm shift? Services, as I suggested, cannot simply copy the push-pull innovation in manufacturing practices, because in service, it's all pull, and always was. And unlike manufacturing, service operations are by their nature just-in-time. They don't need to be told to work to the heartbeat of the customer. Most do that naturally, and with very little choice, or they'll get a reputation for poor service very quickly. But there's one crucial way of comparing service to manufacturing that reveals what form our paradigm shift should take. What is pushed in service organisations is resource. Staffing requirements are worked out in advance on the basis of forecasts and then augmented with various contingencies to cover absence, changes in demand patterns and so on. Look at a resourcing spreadsheet in the service world and it'll look very similar to an old style MRP plan from the manufacturing world. So, in order to apply just-in-time principles to service operations, maybe we should adapt Taiichi Ohno's famous phrase about rivers of inventory. So, resource is like a river that flows through the back office. In service operations, one of the major costs is the staffing cost. And this actually functions in much the same way as inventory in factories. It's there just in case. Just in case someone goes sick, just in case we get more work than planned, just in case the work is more complex than we expected. Now, lowering the river of resource exposes our operational challenges, and having a systematic approach to creating a lean service organisation, that is one without the fat of overstaffing, is essential. So, what is the equivalent of Kanban in service operations? For me, it's what we call active management. Service operations are people businesses, so not surprisingly, it comes down to people and how they behave. The Kanban was the ticket that reordered the inventory on a just-in-time basis. The active manager is the person who makes sure that they have just enough resource and no more to do the work in that hour or that day. So we need to start to test this assertion of mine that service operations apply just-in-case resourcing. Let's be scientific about this and set up a hypothesis that we can test. My hypothesis is that just-in-case resourcing will lead to highly variable productivity, and here's why. We start with variable demand, variable incoming work. This is processed by variable levels of staff. But it's less variable, and more to the point, it's not synchronized with the level of incoming work. Now, if we take those two and combine them in a broad definition of productivity, the amount of work that we get out for the amount of effort that we put in, then what we'll find, not surprisingly, is highly variable productivity. Essentially, productivity will be an unmanaged outcome of the level of work and the level of resource at any point in time. If we do apply just-in-case resourcing, where average levels of staff are pushed into a variable work demand, then we'll get fluctuating productivity. And actually another opportunity to play lean bingo. So, here's the difference between productivity fluctuating as a result of uncoordinated resourcing and a more stable, controlled productivity. And here we see Mudder, the waste of over-resourcing in this case, Muri, overburden, caused by having more work than resource at certain times. And also Murra, inconsistency. And actually it's that inconsistency, the fluctuating productivity, which probably causes most of the problems in operations. It causes stress, uncertainty, difficulties with planning, and so on and so on. So that's my hypothesis, that just-in-case resourcing will lead to fluctuating productivity. But is that borne out in reality? Well, actually yes, and possibly a lot more than you might think. What follows over the next few slides are some live examples from recent clients. I've had to make them anonymous, but trust me, the data is real. So, here's a chart of daily productivity over a few month period. Don't worry too much about the scale, it's really about the relativity that matters. Just look at that level of variation. And here's what we see if we overlay the daily incoming workload. Although the correlation is not perfect, you can see that often the productivity does appear to be driven by the volume of work to be done. The dotted line, by the way, represents the 85th percentile productivity, a figure which we often use for planning purposes. Essentially, this is a level of productivity that is not the maximum, which might be a stretch, but it's the level which has been achieved regularly in the past. And here's a chart from another team. And here we've zoomed in on just one section of that chart to look closely at the relationship between the work received and the productivity. I could show you hundreds of similar charts, but hopefully you get the point. Now, another way of looking at this varying productivity is to plot it as a histogram. This borrows from Six Sigma thinking and looks at variation around a mean. Again, we shouldn't worry too much about the actual productivity scale. Clearly, the standards in this team were so generous that the average productivity was around 200%. The point is that it's still varying around the mean, and if we looked at that as a bell curve, then we can see a simple shape like that. And what we really want is to reduce that variability towards perhaps the 85th percentile, and in doing so we get an overall improvement in productivity. Hopefully you can see that if we could stabilise the productivity around a higher mean value, then there would be fewer hours required to process any given volume of work. By looking back over the historical data and seeing how many hours could have been saved if productivity had been higher gives us a measure of latent capacity. In the case of the team we've been looking at, this would represent a latent capacity of about 24%, or 400 hours that could have been spent on other work. Obviously, this form of wonderful hindsight is a little limited in its practical use, but as a measure of how well the operation has managed to synchronise its resourcing and stabilise its productivity, it can be a useful diagnostic indicator. So, for the last couple of charts in this section, let's look at the level of latent capacity in teams that have been through a lean transformation versus those that haven't. We've been fortunate enough to work with a large bank that was partway through its lean journey. So, what do you think? Is this chart taken from before lean has been implemented or after? It might surprise you to know that it is actually post-lean. We found that although the lean program had delivered a lot of benefits, it hadn't fundamentally synchronized the work and the resource, leaving significant untapped benefits. Indeed, if you look at this slide, which was taken from the feedback that we gave to this client, we found that £25 million of savings was still available, and significantly, we found that much of the benefit could come from teams that had been through the lean transformation. Here, the bars are in different colours to represent the team's status. Blue bars are for teams that have not been through a lean project, and green bars are for those that have. I hope that diversion into data has gone some way to convince you that lowering the river of resource is a key step to achieving change in operational performance. So, how do we do it? If we imagine that we start with highly variable productivity, then our first aim is to try and eliminate the bad days, days when productivity fell particularly low. We're not trying to raise overall productivity or make anybody work harder. Just start by raising the floor. Can you see how just doing this will improve the average productivity? Now, of course, once we've got to this point, we may well want to stretch ourselves, set some higher targets, and raise the bar, and then maybe raise the floor again, and so on. So, if we look at this over time, what we see is reducing variability. Now, you've probably seen enough charts for one day, but this final one shows an important idea regarding reducing variation in a system. And this is core to a lot of operations thinking, and you may well see more of this in discussions about Six Sigma. So, if we look at the variation at the early stage, we would see something like this typical bell curve. Now, if we follow the approach of improving our active management, the variation should reduce. And the overall productivity should improve. This is a really important point. Active management is about making better use of time, not working people harder. It's about working smarter, if you like. So to contrast just-in-time resourcing with the just-in-case alternative, here we see resource being pulled to the work as required. I like to think of this idea of pull as analogous to pulling inventory through a factory on a Kanban system, for those that are interested in that sort of thing. It's just that in factories, the material is being pulled in order to make and assemble components, while in service operations, staff members are being moved in order to maximise productivity. There's also another option available. In our world, where quite often work can be moved electronically or incoming calls can be rerouted in the blink of an eye, we might not always move people to the work. We might also move work to the people. So, if we take this situation on the screen, here we have 3 teams, 2 in surplus, that is, they have more than enough time to do the work, and 1 which is balanced. Now, as luck would have it, the balanced team loses some resource and now has a shortfall. So there are a number of possibilities. First, the team on the right could move some resource into the team with the shortfall. And next, the team with the shortfall could move some work to the team on the left with a surplus. So now we have a situation where all the teams are balanced and we have moved both work and resource. And when we talk about just-in-time resourcing, we're really talking about creating a balance between work and resource just in time, all the time. I want to start to wrap up this presentation now by thinking about where this idea of just-in-time resourcing might go next. Now, I recall that when I worked for Lucas all those years ago, it wasn't long after we got interested in Toyota production system that we started to turn our attention to outsourcing and supply chain integration. And I think the next big thing in service operations will be supply chain integration. Up until now, a lot of offshoring, outsourcing and so on have largely been cost-driven and tactical. But having taken what were once integrated components and broken them up, we now need to be very good at sticking them back together again, just like Toyota. And I think this commentary from Jones and Clark is very revealing. I'll just give you a moment to take a look at it. So they talk a lot about the logic that pervades everything. And I think that getting operations planning and control processes right in service operations and consistent throughout the supply chain is the same thing. We need to have a logic, an active management logic that works all the way through the service equivalent of the supply chain. I'm not sure yet where the big driver for this will come from, but there are some candidates. Maybe those engaged in labour supply will start to drive the just-in-time concept and move to a more strategic resourcing relationship with their customers. Or maybe it will be a BPO provider in the middle or back office who will start to set the standard for operations planning and control that will then be adopted up and down the supply chain. Or just maybe one of the very big customers in service operations, a bank, a government department, will really start to set the standard and pull the BPOs and other providers towards that standard. I don't know, but I am convinced that service operations stands at the brink of its own paradigm shift. We will get better at learning from and not simply copying what worked in other sectors. Thank you for taking time to look through this presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Please feel free to get in touch if you want to discuss, agree or argue with any of the points that we've made. As I said at the start of this talk, the whole idea was to provoke some discussion. Thank you and goodbye for now.